Welcome to today's virtual event, which is part of our new Brave Conversation series, focused today on the topic of polystyrene and brought to you by the Canada Plastics Pact. A very warm welcome to everyone here on the line. We had over 200 people register for today's webinar. My name is Paul Shorthouse. I'm the interim managing director of the Canada Plastics Pact, and I'll be your host and the facilitator for today's virtual event. For those that aren't familiar, the Canada Plastics Pact is a unique multi-stakeholder platform in Canada which aims to tackle plastic packaging waste and pollution by bringing together businesses, governments, non-government organizations, and other sort of key actors across the plastics value chain here in Canada. We're part of a network of organizations and other pacts around the world that are aligned around the Ellen MacArthur Foundation's new plastics economy framework. And our CPP partners are working together on achieving clear, actionable targets that are part of our roadmap to 2025. So a very warm welcome again to everyone here. Next slide, please. Before we kick things off, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm very fortunate to participate today from the unceded territory of the Coast Salish and the Lekwungen speaking peoples here now today called Victoria, BC. We also want to acknowledge that we have attendees joining us from right across the country, from traditional lands of Indigenous peoples, from coast to coast to coast. And so we'd like to join me in a moment of reflection to acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past and to consider how we can each try to move forward in a spirit of reconciliation. Thank you. Next slide. So the CPP is stewarding the Brave Conversation webinar series that's designed to explore and challenge sort of key outstanding issues on areas of tension that are relevant to the circular transition for plastic packaging. And really the series is designed to enable a diversity of perspectives, but really grounded in science and facts rather than driven by pure emotions. And really the first of our Brave Conversation series that is focused on polystyrene and expanded polystyrene will bring some of this conversation to the forefront. One of our targets in CPP's roadmap to 2025 is to define a list of plastic packaging that is to be designated as problematic or unnecessary and to take measures to eliminate them. Simultaneously, we're working to ensure that 100% of plastic packaging that is placed on the market from CPP partners is designed to be reusable, recyclable, or compostable by 2025. And that's a lot of work. It's an ambitious set of targets. Those are a couple of the four. But through today's deep dive on polystyrene and EPS, we're going to explore perspectives on the current market and policy situation in Canada. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the emerging technologies and the considerations around the recyclability of this resin, including if potential viable near-term pathways for circularity could exist at scale. And I think that's a key word, at scale. With us today, and if you go to the next slide, we have a great group of speakers that are part of our panel that'll help us to unpack this topic, which we'll introduce them all in just a moment. Again, it's not so much a debate. Of course, there will be different perspectives, but again, we're looking for that sort of fact-based conversation to guide the current realities and where we might be heading in this space. Next slide. So for today's agenda, I'm going to provide just a brief background, a little background and opening context on the current situation. We'll invite all of the speakers to make some brief opening remarks, and then we'll open it up to a bit of a panel discussion. We're going to save time for audience participation and Q&A towards the end of the session. So you should see in your Zoom webinar box there a Q&A box where you can drop your questions into the chat, and we will do our best to extract sort of a few of the questions and get to as many as we can sort of in rapid sequence in the second half of the agenda today. So without further ado, if we can go to the next slide, and one more, provide a little more background context. So polystyrene, it's a synthetic resin, which is a polymer of styrene and can be made into various formats, but a rigid format or turned into a very lightweight foam that many people are familiar with. It's recognized under resin identification code number 6. And rigid polystyrene is used for a range of different applications, packaging products like cutlery and clamshells, drinking cups, different types of containers. We'll hear a little bit more about that shortly. EPS, or expanded polystyrene, is a cellular material that's consisting of sort of small, hollow, spherical balls that are expanded through a blowing and molding process. And it's used primarily in insulated food and non-food packaging, as well as in construction materials. Next slide. In 2018, Canada consumed over 760 kilotons of polystyrene resins in many different types of products, equal to about 12% of all the total resins produced for Canadian consumption. And while we used to produce more of this resin in Canada, the industry today is fairly limited to a small number of plants making sort of the EPS, or expanded polystyrene beads, particularly following the closure of a couple major facilities back in 2007 or 2008. Next slide. This information here on this slide comes from the new plastics flow work that's been done by Stats Canada in collaboration with Environment Canada. Of that 760 kilotons of polystyrene resins in products that are consumed by Canadians every year, about 560 kilotons remain in use at the end of each year. So that's considered sort of our net stock. 206 kilotons a year are discarded, of which about 99% of those materials are collected, and about 1% are considered leaked plastics into the environment. So we're talking about, of that discarded amount, about 34 kilotons of polystyrene and EPS foam were diverted for material recovery in 2018, which is about 16% of what was discarded. And only about 10%, or 20 kilotons, of what was discarded was effectively recycled, and even less for EPS, which we'll hear about in a moment, which really makes it one of the least recycled thermoplastic resins in Canada today. Now, looking historically doesn't necessarily mean it's the future, but that's our current picture. EPS that is densified is often exported after processing and recycling to manufacturers outside of Canada, including more than about 50% being sent to Asia and Europe. Next slide, please. So cost-effective collection and sort of the general lack of markets for PS and EPS resin limit many plastic recyclers from accepting the materials today. Because the vast majority of EPS is made up of air, about 98%, it has historically not been cost-effective to transport long distances in order to sort of densify the material. And this challenge around transportation and logistics, combined with often high contamination rates, means that there are currently limited municipal-based collection programs that accept EPS. So access rates for EPS collection for non-food protected packaging, for example, in Canada, were about 44% on average in 2017, with BC and Ontario being somewhat exceptions, but several prairie and Atlantic provinces offering no collection or recycling services for EPS. If you see on the right here, the access rates for rigid polystyrene are better, with an average of about 71% across Canada in 2017. Next slide. So we're in a space of sort of evolving policy and other market and industry factors and drivers. In the policy space, we know the federal government has introduced a ban on single-use items, including EPS for takeout containers. Provincially, we're seeing regulation like EPR and other factors influencing the market. In Quebec, for example, by 2027, they're now requiring collection of 50% of all types of packaging that is brought to market, and an effective recycling rate of 40% of all materials, including PS and EPS. And we're seeing that similar just south of the border in the US, where we're seeing bans or regulation on how foam products are used. In California, for example, the Senate Bill 54, which was passed in June of this year, sets really stringent recycling standards on EPS food serviceware, and that requires that a 25% recycling rate be met by 2025 and a 65% rate by 2032. So the policy is moving fast in this space. We at the CPP have also aligned around the golden design rules, which were put forward by the Consumer Goods Forum to help design sort of packaging for recyclability and a more circular plastics economy. Golden design rule number 2 is focused on removing problematic elements from plastic packaging. And we've developed Canadian-specific guidance that suggests where there is a viable alternative, companies should aim to remove EPS or PS from packaging portfolios, which should be done, obviously, with an assessment of sort of the net environmental impact of the LCA. side of things. But our guidance also recognizes that considerable investments in collection and recycling technologies for polystyrene are underway. And should collection or recycling performance of this be proven at scale, which means at least 30% effectively being recycled between now and the end of 2023, the Canadian guidance could allow for an exception to GDR number 2 for PS or EPS. But we recognize this is a very short timeline, is one of the reasons really we're hosting today's conversation, to understand sort of the current situation and some of the nuances. So that's my opening. And if we go to the next slide, I'd like to just take a pulse of our audience here by sharing a quick poll. And that is really to understand if you feel that there is a role for polystyrene, expanded polystyrene in a sustainable Canadian circular economy, plastics economy. And yes, no, undecided. We'll see where we land with this. Give everybody another 30 seconds to enter their thoughts, and then we'll share back the results here. All right, a few more trickling in. We've got 85 out of 107 that have weighed in. Still trickling in. Why don't we share back the results, Isabel, if you don't mind? Okay, so 42% undecided, and kind of a close but even split for the yeses and the nos. About a quarter say yes, there is a place, and a third say no. So interesting. Thank you very much for sharing those results. And we're going to bring that same question back up in a little bit and see how the people's thoughts have maybe stayed the same or shifted. But with that, we're going to now introduce our first speaker to provide some opening remarks. And I'd like to bring up the next slide if we could, and invite Cassie from INEOS to join us, who is INEOS's Styro Solutions Sustainability and Circular Economy Commercial Manager, who is working with leaders in the polystyrene recycling industry. She'll tell us a little bit more about that, and she's joining us from the US. So thank you very much, Cassie. Over to you.
Thanks a lot, Paul. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. I'm thrilled to be here with you all today. As Paul mentioned, my name is Cassie Bradley, and I'm Sustainability Commercial Manager at INEOS Styrolution. So INEOS Styrolution is a global styrenics resin producer with over 3,600 employees across 10 countries across the world. We manufacture plastic pellets that our customers mold or extrude into end products that most of us use every day. Our products have over 2,000 applications across 7 industries, including construction, sports and leisure, packaging, automotive, electronics, healthcare, and household applications such as appliances. So among our many styrenics products, we produce polystyrene resin. Polystyrene can be used in a rigid form, so think party cups and refrigerator interiors, or it can be foamed and used to insulate homes or to insulate your hand from that hot cup of coffee. In fact, this material is unparalleled in its combination of performance and sustainable properties. For instance, a foam coffee cup is over 98% air, which means that less plastic is actually used to produce that product, especially when you consider that alternative materials often require a cup sleeve that, let's face it, doesn't prevent you from doing a hot potato with your cup of morning joe. PS also combines strength and barrier properties, which make it an effective and sustainable choice for food packaging, requiring only a single layer of polystyrene, as opposed to the need for multiple layers of alternative materials, which then cannot be separated for recycling. The other good news is that polystyrene is recyclable. In fact, polystyrene is the plastic which is best suited for not just recycling, but for full circularity. Its simple molecular structure allows for it to be both mechanically recycled, as well as recycled using new technologies that zip and unzip the polymer chain an infinite number of times without degrading the polymer, and requiring less energy than fossil-based material production. INEOS Styrolution has announced several projects and partnerships to commercialize this technology, which is currently operating at demonstration scale. Polystyrene's unique structure also allows it to be sorted to a high purity using infrared technology, since the structure can be easily differentiated from that of other plastics, as INEOS Styrolution has demonstrated in our partnership with TOMRA. This means that polystyrene can be mechanically recycled into food-grade product, which we have also demonstrated in practice. At INEOS Styrolution, we are the experts on polystyrene, and we are working hard to bring the polystyrene circular economy to life. For over 90 years, polystyrene has enabled the innovation in industries from healthcare to technology that has driven our society and our economy forward. And INEOS Styrolution believes that innovation in polystyrene itself will enable us to reach our next goal of a circular and sustainable economy. While polystyrene itself is our expertise, we're excited to work with other members of the value chain, such as collection and sorting, as well as our customers, the plastics converters, to bring these innovations to Canada. So thank you, and excited for the rest of the conversation.
Thanks, Cassie, for that introduction, and also some examples of applications and some of the benefits that you're seeing. Why don't we go to Karen Wersig with Environmental Defense. And Karen is a former journalist. She is a labor and community organizer and is passionate about getting plastics out of the environment. And so with that, I'll introduce Karen and allow her to make a few opening remarks. And I think, Karen, you have a few slides you'd like to share as well.
Yeah.
Over to you.
Thanks, Paul. So, hello, I'm Colleen from Toronto.
I'm going to turn your camera on too, Karen. Sorry.
Oh, I did try to do that and it didn't work. The host has stopped my camera, so maybe somebody who's hosting that webinar has to turn on.
We'll work on that, but yeah, please go ahead.
Okay, thanks. So Environmental Defense is a leading Canadian environmental advocacy organization with tens of thousands of supporters who take action to protect the environment from plastic pollution. We're a nonpartisan, fact-based collaborative organization. And that was my first slide, actually, so maybe we could advance past the first slide to the second slide. What we support is the government's goal of zero plastic waste by 2030. We also support laws and regulation to require a reduction of plastics at source because we believe that is the only way to eliminate plastic waste. And as part of that reduction at source, we are promoting really a shift to the reuse, widespread and convenient reuse of packaging and containers, and to get away from single-use packaging and containers, and of course products in general where they're single-use. We also support a safe recyclability of plastics, and we campaign against false solutions, including bio-based and compostable packaging, and also kind of new, what are sometimes called innovations, but which we see to be really false solutions of plastic incineration, including plastic waste to fuel and waste to chemicals that don't end up producing new plastic products. So I was asked to talk about polystyrene recycling a little bit. I think I'd just like to start quickly by talking about our concerns in general about recycling. We have a report coming out next week, and not to totally give away our secrets or anything, but I think what the report shows is that recycling will not get us to zero plastic waste. A focus and an obsession with recycling won't get us to zero plastic waste. In fact, recycling doesn't prevent plastic waste, it relies on plastic waste. It's also a major target of corporate greenwashing that has led to a loss of credibility with the public. We get tons of messages from our supporters and others who are so concerned about, why it feels like they've been lied to on the validity and even the ability to recycle plastic. I mean, the StatsCan and Environment Canada are now sort of demonstrating that only 8% of discarded plastic is recycled into new products. That is as of 2018, the latest data from StatsCan. When that 8% of plastic waste is recycled into new products, though, most of those are not circular that's not a circular recycling process in which those same products can be captured and recycled again. Most of those things are what we call downcycled into products that will ultimately make their way to landfills. So it's not necessarily a circular system that we have. And I think what the last beach cleanup, which is a group in California that has really taken up a lot of the charge against the false claims of recycling in the US, has noted is that post-consumer packaging is recycled much less than pre-consumer material. So it's much easier to gather, fairly uniform packaging that comes from post-industrial uses or cut-offs and whatever, and recycle those into something. It's much more complicated to collect post-consumer packaging and safely recycle it. We also know that the granular data on recycling is as yet unreliable. We really do hope that the government's plan for a registry helps fill in a lot of those blanks. And there's a growing concern in the environmental community and beyond, in the health community, about the concentration of toxicants in recycled polymers. So that's just recycling in a nutshell, our concerns about recycling. But we're also we're also very concerned about the dangers of polystyrene, which is a likely human carcinogen in its in its singular form, not its polymer form, monomer form. EPA has identified polystyrene manufacturing as the 5th largest US source of toxic pollution. Styrene producers are major emitters of the known carcinogen benzene. And in fact, INEOS has been identified as the major fence line contaminator of benzene in the Aamjiwnaang First Nation near Sarnia, which is a huge environmental justice concern for us and for a lot of people. The other problem is that polystyrene is a very stable polymer, which I think Cassie alluded to. But what that means is, as these New Zealand-based researchers have pointed out, humans have the capacity to produce polystyrene, but we can never make it go away. And so what that means is, as Paul pointed out, all of the polystyrene that builds up in nature and in landfills will really almost never go away. The other thing about polystyrene is that Basel Action Network, on the recycling end of it, Basel Action Network has flagged that Canadian exports a lot of polystyrene scrap to non-OECD countries, which is a very big concern about whether those countries really have the capacity to safely recycle it. I would just say the other question I would raise here is, if the US Plastics Pact has already identified polystyrene as a problematic and unnecessary material, it seems very strange that Canada's list would be different and that we would somehow have a magical solution to polystyrene that our US-based colleagues would not. And I'll just leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you, Karen, for sharing some stats and data there on some of the current realities. Appreciate that. We're going to invite Kimmy from Canadian Tire to provide a retailer's perspective. Kimmy is working to advance collaboration and innovation and really system change, both sort of internally and with external partners at Canadian Tire, focused on reducing their environmental impact through the circular economy and related capabilities. So over to you, Kimmy.
Thanks, Paul. And hello, everybody. An interesting conversation that I'm sure that many of us, especially in the retail and the producer side, have been thinking about for a long time. So Canadian Tire, our purpose is we are here to make life in Canada better. And better is one of those subjective pieces that apply to a whole bunch of areas within Canadian Tire. And as you know, we sell a lot of different products. So we see polystyrene or expanded polystyrene in a lot of the products, either the packaging or actually in the product themselves. So we're kind of looking at it from a number of different perspectives. We always look at it from a customer perspective, and we've heard loud and clear that people want any of the packaging that they take home with a Canadian Tire product, that they should be able to put it in their blue bin curbside program. And today, as I think Paul showed on some of those slides, we can't do that in Canada. And we can't even do that in where I live in Ontario. So different municipalities have different pieces. So we have been looking at viable alternatives, especially for expanded polystyrene, because we know some of the challenges with that. Although the materials can be recycled, they're very often not collected or they're not processed. So we're trying to give our customers some better packaging. And primarily, we've been looking at different types of fiber, whether it's molded fiber or corrugate, to protect the products that we sell, because we always want our customers to be able to take home something that is complete, that's not dented, that meets their expectations on the quality of the product that they have. And we also know from an environmental perspective, damaged products have a far worse impact than any of the packaging. So where it is viable, we have already moved. And that's in some of the standards that we provide to our vendors. I think some of the challenges that we do have where we have extended polystyrene is in some big heavy items. So if you're buying a metal gazebo that weighs 300 pounds, if you are buying a tool chest that might weigh 200 pounds, how do we not add too much weight to those products? Make sure that they're still protected and arrive in pristine condition for our customers, and not have an excessive cost, because cost is also something that is important to our customers, and we want to make sure that that's also a consideration. So where there are simple solutions, we've done them already. Where there are some other pieces, we're working on it, and for those hard ones, we're still looking for some viable solutions to make sure that they meet all our customer needs. I think on polystyrene, on the rigid side, we have far less of an application when it comes to packaging. So there's not so much in our packaging today based on what we know. And there are some simple and easy substitutions that you can do there. I think the challenge that we see is in some of the other products that we sell. So for those who don't know, Party City is part of the Canadian Tire family. And if you look at plates and cups and cutlery, there's a lot of polystyrene there. So there are some great functional capabilities of polystyrene that Cassie covered pretty well. And whether it's a barrier or whether it's heat transfer, those are some of the things that are unique. So we're looking for better alternatives. So if you have some creative ideas, please shoot them my way, because we're trying to be better, but we still have a lot of work to do. And of course, in retail, you're looking 12 to 18 months out. So unfortunately for everybody, that means at Canadian Tire, Christmas is over. And we're already looking at the end of 2023 and into 2024. So to get change done, we need to think about what's in place today and how can we deliver all the expectations that our customers are looking for.
Thank
That's
you,
it for
Kimmy,
me.
for that perspective and for sharing some of the challenges you're facing, and also the fact that your timelines are fairly extensive in terms of how you can move forward on solutions in the near term. I encourage others, participants, to add your questions into the Q&A box as we go, and we'll collect those for discussion. I see a few come in, which is great, so keep those up. I'm now going to invite Robert Harrett from Styrogo, who has been working in the recycling industry for almost 15 years and has spent the last 8 years making EPS polystyrene recycling a mainstream service here in Western Canada. So Rob, share a little bit in your opening remarks about your solution.
Thanks, Paul. Did my camera come on?
You're looking good.
Sounds good. Alrighty, so yes, my name is Robert Harrett, president and founder of Styrogo. We've been around for about 7 years now, and really it was started just, as when I identified that, styrofoam collection, polystyrene EPS, or styrofoam as everybody uses the shorthand, there wasn't really any viable collection and ways to make it work in a systematic fashion. And so it took about 18 months to figure the logistics and technology out. Because really it was kind of that missing link in the recycling food chain that we couldn't pick up material, especially further away from major metropolitan areas. And so that's where really that was the missing link that I sought to solve. Fast forward the tape to now, Styrogo services over 70 municipalities and hundreds of clients across BC and Alberta. We do pretty much the entire province of Alberta, most of BC, including Vancouver Island. And we've recently expanded limited service into Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Northern BC, and even most recently Whitehorse. So, you know, and to just give a nutshell of who we are, what we do, and how it works, we've got a mobile hot melt densifier on a regular size 5-ton truck with 2 guys. And so it's a very lean and mean, cost-effective program. And forgive me for those who don't know the geography as well, but like the Calgary truck would service from Red Deer down to the US border. The Edmonton hub would be Red Deer and north out to Lloydminster and up northern Alberta and so forth. The Calgary truck, for instance, would, you know, leave the city and go to the next door neighbor community of Okotoks, do the eco center there, and then various commercial enterprises. And then we drive 20 minutes down the road to High River, another community, do their eco center, and so forth and so forth. And we do the whole milk run all the way down highway number 2 to Lethbridge. And actually we go now as far as Tabor, which is a community about 35 or 40 minutes past Lethbridge. So by the time the guys get everything on their way, all the way down out to Tabor, they will have covered, you know, that's 300 kilometers away. And they will have picked up anywhere from, you know, 15 to as much as 35 different pickup locations and processed and densified anywhere from 1 to 1.5 to as much as 4 tractor trailer loads of styrofoam waste. And that'll be all shrunk on site, hot melted in bricks on a pallet, shrink wrapped and ready for export. And certainly in getting the company up and running, one of the things that was very important as our friends at Environmental Defense highlighted, and that is the need to not just greenwash it, say it's recycling, but actually prove it. I've been to every factory that we work with overseas in Spain, Portugal, Netherlands, China, and Malaysia. And I've been to many others in Turkey and Vietnam and other places. And you know, those particular locations weren't up to what we were looking for. And so we don't work with them. And we're big enough where we're doing tens of thousands of pounds a week, where we ship directly to the manufacturers. And we're a big enough player now where we work directly with them. And we have a complete tracking containment where when it leaves the Calgary warehouse or Edmonton or Vancouver or whatever, we know the day it leaves, we know when it leaves port, we know when it hits the other port, we know when it hits the factory floor, everything, all the way up to what it gets made into. And we were recently able to provide that to one of our clients. Most recently, we've expanded into EPE, and certainly, you know, plastic recycling is doable, and certainly Stargo's proud to be a part of that solution as it moves forward. Thanks,
Rob. Yeah, thanks for sharing that example, and interesting to hear of your process and how you've been working with companies across the Western Canada provinces. And speaking of Western Canadian provinces, I'm going to invite our next panel participant, Sam Baker from Recycle BC, to provide his perspective. Sam has been with Recycle BC for over 5 years, where he oversees the reverse supply chain team responsible for receiving, reporting, and responsibly recycling all the materials within Recycle BC's sort of extended producer responsibility program for packaging and paper products. So Sam, over to you. And you're on mute.
Let me get off mute here. Great. Thank you, Paul. So as Paul mentioned, Recycle BC is responsible for the residential packaging and paper recycling in BC. We are an extended producer responsibility program. I will speak mostly to expanded polystyrene. We do accept rigid polystyrene in our program, and we do recycle it, and it does not pose an overly large problem. But it's really EPS that is the biggest, would be the hardest to handle, let's say. So, and it's not, a lot of people think that it's on the end market side. So where do we recycle this material? In fact, as Rob mentioned, there are quite a few end markets out there. So it's not impossible to find end markets. The real struggle and the biggest issues are the cost and inconvenience to handle this material. So it is by far the most expensive material to handle in our program because it's a very friable material, meaning that it breaks up very easily. It's not something that we want commingled with our curbside material, because then it becomes much harder to recycle. And much harder to get a clean quality product that end markets want at the end of the day. So in our program, we have about 250 depots in our network. And so that is where we collect this material. So it's a depot only material. Residents have to bring it to their local depot. We have about a 99% access rate in BC for these depots. And to give you a sense of cost, so we pay these depots $2,000 per ton for the EPS that they collect. And if we look at other materials that they collect for us, so for paper packaging, we pay them up to $88 per ton. And for mixed containers, which would include your rigid polystyrene, we pay them up to $169 per ton. So you can see that right there, the price differential for this material. It is exceptionally expensive, but it doesn't end there. So then from the back of the depot, that's where our post-collection network comes into effect. So they're responsible for picking it up at the depot, transporting it to the nearest receiving facility. We have about 40 receiving facilities across the province. As you know, BC is a very large province, so transporting a loose expanded polystyrene is very GHG intensive and costly. As an example, a 53-foot trailer, we can fit about 700 kilograms of loose material in there. If we densify it, we get up to 13,000 kilograms. So that's about a 19-to-1 factor, and that trailer typically could hold about 19 to 20 tons of other recyclables. So we really want to and need to densify it as soon as possible, but that is a challenge into itself. It's a costly process. It's very manual, and there is a lot of, dirt or stickers or water, all pose challenges in the densification process. So that's just a high-level overview, give you a little bit of a sense of what we struggle with on the expanded polystyrene side. Having said all that, with the costs, in 2021, we were able to achieve a recovery rate of 41% on this material. So I think that is probably pretty good as we compare across Canada, but it's a long way from the full piece of the pie. So thank you.
Thanks, Sam. Was that 41% recovery for EPS specifically, or for all types of polystyrene?
Yeah, EPS.
EPS. Thanks for sharing some of your challenges. And lastly, would love to welcome Tunde from the Conference Board of Canada, who will share his perspectives on some of the work they've been doing and research on emerging technologies in this space. Tunde is their essentially leading up their research projects in areas of innovation and competitiveness, investment attraction, sustainable finance, and circular economy policies, including in sectors like petrochemicals and plastics. So over to you, Tunde.
Thanks for the introduction, Paul. A great conversation thus far. In my opening remarks, I just want to build on the context that was provided earlier on polystyrene. So as you rightly mentioned, Paul, 12% of all plastics consumed in the form of polystyrene in Canada. But one thing that's important to keep in mind is that even though we have been seeing, an increase in number of bans, particularly at the municipal level across Canada for polystyrene, certain specific types of polystyrene, as well as the US, polystyrene consumption has increased significantly in Canada. If you compare where we were in 2012 to consumption levels in 2018, consumption levels have risen by 22% in Canada. Further to that is that if you take a look at the diversion of the discarded polystyrene to material recovery facilities, so as you rightly pointed out in that graphic at the beginning of the conversation, we take a look at the progress that has been made. It's quite notable. The amount of polystyrene that has been discarded that actually makes it to the material recovery facilities to be sorted and baled has increased by 40% since 2012. So comparing 2012 to 2018. And lastly, the amount of recycled polystyrene pellets and flakes that are being produced in Canada has increased by 30% from 2012 to 2018. So there are some green shoots, if you will. There's some reason for optimism that indeed we can move the dial on recycling polystyrene material, in the right direction, and make it much and keeping it out of the environment. But these statistics, while encouraging, they do not obviate the, formidable challenge that we have with this particular material. As you mentioned in your opening, Paul, only 16% makes it to the material recovery facilities as of 2018. And even when they make it there, a lot of the material recovery facilities actually bale polystyrene as part and parcel of the mixed plastics bale. So they're actually not baled as a single stream, pure stream material at the MRFs. Now that has important ramifications for the technologies that are being positioned to address polystyrene pollution and obviously move polystyrene recycling in the right direction. So as you can appreciate, what we're seeing right now in terms of emerging technologies are entities looking to deploy. I'll start with the near-term technology in the mechanical recycling realm. Entities looking to deploy mechanical recycling that can actually provide food-grade recycled resin. We're seeing that entities moving that forward, INEOS and others. But that's also going to require quite a pure stream of polystyrene that's actually sorted. And so there's a disconnect between what's available at the MRFs and the feedstocks that are actually required for these sorts of recycling technologies. Then if we move over from the mechanical recycling realm to the chemical recycling realm, which is chemical recycling is a broad umbrella term for really three categories of technologies that can be used to address recycling and have capabilities of recycling, producing feedstock, producing polymers or producing monomers. So if you take a look at, say, purification and depolymerization technologies, purification recycles back to the polymer. They require, again, a pure stream of polystyrene. They're only capable of recycling one resin at a time, at least for the technologies that we know. And for the depolymerization technologies that can recycle back to the monomer, that is, to styrene, again, a pure stream is required. So again, there's a disconnect between the sort of feedstocks that are needed for these technologies and what's available at the MRFs. But then if we take a look at the last category of chemical recycling technologies, particularly pyrolysis, this is capable of using mixed plastic streams. So the feedstocks available at the MRFs are actually well suited. Pyrolysis is well suited to handle that. But pyrolysis also introduces a number of important factors that we have to take into serious consideration if we're serious about enabling circular economy or circular polystyrene in Canada. One is that the quality of pyrolysis oil that's being produced in terms of pyrolysis is really not is inferior compared to the commodity that it is intended to displace, being naphtha. Naphtha being used to produce monomers. So there's a quality issue that needs to be addressed. And secondly, a number of opponents of pyrolysis actually, rather than going plastic to plastic recycling, actually use the waste plastics to produce fuels. And of course, that is not in line with not only our carbon mitigation goals, our climate change priorities, but it also introduces a danger of taking away limited feedstock, shortage of feedstock. We have a supply side issue in this regard, taking away limited feedstock and using that for activities that, first of all, don't produce new plastics, and second of all, also incur significant emissions. So we really have to have a conversation as to what technologies we want to see in advancing polystyrene circularity in Canada and how that aligns with our broader industrial strategy in the chemical sector. I'll leave it there, Paul.
Thank you, Tunde. Great perspectives just on the current state and maybe some of the trends that we've seen both on the sort of collection side and sorting, as well as the technologies that are kind of coming to the forefront, at least as potential pathways or opportunities. I'd like to maybe invite the other panel and speakers to turn on their cameras, and we'll open up more of a discussion amongst the group here. We can stop sharing the slides and all see each other better that way. And Tunde, I liked sort of some of the information that you were sharing. Maybe I'll kick it off to you just in terms of a question that the group can also respond to, thinking about it as sort of a system. You mentioned different pieces of the system, but when we think about actual potential pathways to circularity for polystyrene or EPS in Canada, how do we think about this as a system? What are the potential ways of getting there? Any thoughts on on that as a system whole?
Yeah, great question. And indeed, systems thinking is what we need in this arena. I would start by saying, first of all, we have a supply side issue. We don't have enough material that's making it to the MRFs to even have a chance of being put back in the economy in the first place. We need to actually address that, and that will take the solution. The way the solution will look would be different if you're talking about the residential sector versus the industrial, commercial, institutional sector. So we need to have a conversation as to what increased uptake of material in both of these sectors look like in terms of getting these materials in the MRFs and getting them to the recyclers who can add value. We also need to have a conversation about polystyrene, playing a role in the reuse plastics economy. There's going to be, recycling is not going to solve plastics pollution in its entirety. It's going to be make a significant contribution, but we really need the reuse arena to kick off in Canada. And for that to happen, I think there needs to be a rethink in terms of the design of polystyrene packaging, with durability increasing in its weighting, if you will, and its priority that's assigned to the design of polystyrene packaging. Then I also think we need infrastructure investments, as Sam mentioned. There are depots that are used in BC. We need increased avenues whereby pure streams of polystyrene can be deployed and made available to those who can add value to them. That is something we're not seeing. The picture is quite different across Canada. We need much more avenues of pure stream polystyrene material because, as I mentioned, the recycling technologies, be they mechanical, be they chemical, would benefit immensely from having a pure stream available. Then lastly, I'll just mention the fact that when we take a look at the chemical recycling, if we're successful at getting back to the monomer, one of the measures of circularity that polystyrene could contribute to us is really producing recycled styrene, which doesn't necessarily have to be used to produce new polystyrene, but could also be used to produce new products like synthetic rubber materials and other specialty materials in the economy. So those are my thoughts on what we can do to get and enable circularity in polystyrene, Paul.
Interesting. Maybe Cassie, I'll turn to you then as a resin manufacturer and producer. You're probably also looking at recycled content and the ability to reintegrate that into resin production. Maybe any thoughts from your perspective on, are there potential pathways to circularity here at scale?
Yeah, absolutely. So I agree with, most of what Tunde said. I think there are several pathways that are possible. And I know as INEOS Revolution, we are looking at many of them. And some of it will just depend on what the legislative landscape is and what the state of the supply landscape is. As Tunde mentioned, there's mixed waste pyrolysis solutions and single stream depolymerization solutions. And I don't think there's going to be one single silver bullet solution for everything. There will probably be a network of solutions and technologies that utilize the waste or the feedstock in this case in the most optimal way. So in terms of how it's being sorted, what the contamination or non-contamination level is, and what the technology or solution with the littlest footprint, so the least impact on greenhouse gases, the most efficient in terms of energy. We want to recycle the material in the most efficient way possible. So I don't think there's a silver bullet solution. There's many pathways, and I think the system will develop accordingly as we go along.
Sam, what's your take on the collection issues you mentioned? Have you been exploring solutions in this space? I know you said it's cost prohibitive or it's very expensive in some cases. What's your take as a stewardship agency around potential pathways to circularity?
Yeah, it's a challenge because to get that uptake from the residents, really you want it to go into curbside recycling, right? But as Tunde mentioned, as soon as you put it in there, then the quality goes way down. And can you find a market for that solution? And does it break up and just cause mess everywhere? So that's one challenge. Like, how do you make it convenient? because convenience is king for recycling. I think it's going to be interesting as EPR programs start to roll out across Canada and now down into the US as well, as producers are starting to see the full extent of the costs of some of their packaging choices. And as EPS rises to the top as one of the most expensive, is that something that producers are going to be willing to continue to fund, or are they going to find alternates that will reduce their bill on the EPR side? So, yeah, I mean, short of having staff depots, designated streams, a good network of densifiers, that's kind of what it takes to get really good quality material and access, right?
So a bunch of pieces that have to come together to make the system work effectively is what I'm hearing. You know, the supply side issues that Tunde mentioned. You know, CPP's Canadian guidance with respect to the Golden Design Rules, which I mentioned earlier on, with respect to polystyrene EPS, puts the resin on our watch list over the next couple of years as problematic material. And as I mentioned earlier, if we can't reach recycling at scale by the end of 2023, we may see bans become widely adopted. And so I guess I'd love to get the sense from some of the others here, you know, what would it take to achieve this goal in the next couple of years at scale? Is it even possible? And when I say at scale, 30% sort of recycling effectively. Anyone want to jump in on that one? Maybe Karen as a starting place?
Well, I'm probably the least capable here of talking about how to get it to scale. I think Sam has a much better sense of, I mean, I'm hearing from him, probably not. I think trying to square the circle of polystyrene packaging is a fool's errand. And we should, if we want to think about systemic thinking, we should get out of agree that the way the US Plastics Pact has, that polystyrene is not really, is a problematic material for packaging, and get away from packaging. There may be other uses. I think a lot of environmentalists think that styrene and polystyrene alone are so problematic that they should be reconsidered altogether. But there may be other uses, and there may be more reuse applications that could be considered, maybe not for food packaging, but for other forms of packaging to protect, you know, valuable goods, right? I would not waste a lot of time and resources trying to figure out post-consumer polystyrene packaging recycling. I think we should be focusing as producers, as regulators, and as citizens on trying to shift away from all the single-use packaging, simplify, like really focus on what single-use packaging is absolutely necessary, focus on limiting the numbers of the complexity of that packaging so that it can be collected. Think about the full life cycle so that it can be collected and effectively recycled in a circular way, so that we're not constantly pulling new resources from the earth to produce single-use packaging, which is what we do 99% of the time today, right? And that we really focus, if we're talking about system change, on scaling up reusable systems. I think the primary target of that right now should be food, because we know that recycled content for food is going to be complicated. There's a lot of concerns about health and safety in recycled content for food. Reuse and refillable containers, this should be the focus of any systemic change right now on packaging, and not wasting a lot of time trying to scale up some white elephant idea between now and 2023. Sorry, just thought I'd say it as plainly as possible.
Thanks, Karen. Kimmy, I might ask you next, as a retailer, you mentioned some of the challenges you have. Not all the products that you have on your shelves are made by Canadian Tire manufacturers, et cetera. Some of them are imported, for example. So that material does enter the market. We have to be able to deal with it, at least in the short term. Any thoughts from your perspective on, whether we can look at this 2023 timeline realistically?
So I think Canada is not alone in what it's trying to do in regards to reducing plastic waste. So whether you look at any of the other countries in the EU, everybody's trying to do this. And your timing is really good, because Kent Wooten, who's part of my team, who many of you know, we did some vendor training yesterday with some of our big vendors, and they're already on that path, and they know. And we're not the only retailer that's also asking to look at the packaging and trying to make it simpler and more easily recyclable. So I think everybody's aligned. It's just trying to figure out how fast you can do so that 2023 is close. I think per one of the comments that was in the chat box, looking at expanded polystyrene versus polystyrene, I think the solutions might be different. And Sam brought up some really good points about collection and some of the challenges in getting a non-contaminated stream. Also, just because EPS is so big and bulky, the volumes make it very easy to transport, but not very cost effectively, or when you're thinking about greenhouse gas. And, at our distribution centers on the operations side, we've had an EPS heat densifier for, 10, 15 years. And where you've got a centralized source, you can compress so that it makes it effective to recycle. Domestically, though, there's not a great market for polystyrene, right? So our stuff goes to a party that uses it in construction insulation. But, besides picture frames, and Robert, I know, is doing a great job of finding other uses for reusing it. It's not circular, right? So we're extending the life, but we're not finding a circular solution. I think chemical recycling and some of the companies that are doing stuff in Quebec, how do you get that going faster? And does that become more the focus for rigid polystyrene versus EPS? I think those are some of the things that, if we can move faster, might be solutions for a part of the polystyrene program.
Interesting. Rob, you're part of that puzzle in terms of the densification and providing a technology or a solution to at least companies and stewardship agencies in Western Canada. What are your similar companies doing in other parts of Canada, and like how potentially scalable is your solution, and how quickly, when we're thinking about kind of a 2023 timeline?
Sure. And I mean, where we see ourselves fitting into that, food chain for recycling is, polystyrene, the vast majority of polystyrene waste comes from outside of Canada. So, part of the problem is these are beyond our regulations, and certainly, it's the most cost-effective packaging material coming from Asia and many of these places. It's an above-ground resource, and where the technology is coming to market, it will displace, by recycling what is coming into our country, it will displace raw virgin petro inputs for materials that are needed here. Most notably, I guess a good example is Pyroway from Montreal. They've partnered up with Michelin, where now 12% of the tires is recycled resin from polystyrene. They're on track, they feel, to be at 30% recycled resin by 2030. And they said even EVs need tires. And although we have been working with overseas manufacturers, we've recently found 2 domestic polystyrene recyclers that can take our densified bricks and recycle them 100% into new styrofoam products here. So we're completely displacing some construction materials and so forth with 100% recycled resin that, without our input, would be coming from under the ground. And so, so I really see it as the market is looking for ways that to, divert that material from waste, and, it will displace virgin materials where, we keep the virgin materials for the ultra pure stuff like hospital rooms and stuff where it has to be ultra pure virgin plastic, and stuff that doesn't have to be at such a high grade, like car tires and so forth, and insulation panels that are going to get put in the ground of a house anyway, that can easily be recycled resin. And there's no need to pull virgin petrol product out just to foam it and put it back in the ground again.
Thanks, that's great. I'm conscious of time, and I want to get to some of the questions that have been coming in through the Q&A box. So maybe I'll just put forward one more question, and it's more around, along with the timelines, the consideration around bans of this product or this resin. What are the alternative materials that we can be thinking about, if they exist, in applications where they're relevant? And are there unintended consequences really of bringing forward bans of polystyrene, or perhaps a a subset of the resin like EPS, for example. So Karen, have you looked at that? I guess just curious out of the alternative perspective, and then maybe quickly from Tunde and Cassie, just getting their perspectives on alternative pathways and unintended consequences.
Well, I think to us, I mean, the alternatives to single-use plastics is not other plastics, not necessarily other single-use materials, but really reusables. And I would say for packaging and the kind of, when we're trying to protect very valuable goods, these are not things that are bought every day, and there should be a reverse logistics system set up to deliver a fridge and take the packaging back so that that packaging can be used for another fridge, right? Or another precious item that obviously you don't want to ruin while you're delivering it. That would be a terrible waste of every component that's in the fridge as well. So, right, like we get why this protective packaging is needed. I think for those kinds of purposes, if polystyrene is useful as a packaging material, can it be made durable and reusable? I think that would go a long way to avoiding regrettable substitutions and problems down the road. And I would caution against any single-use replacement. I mean, looking at fibers is a great idea. Looking at lightweight fibers is a great idea. Hopefully those can be actually reusable fibers in a system where you can get them back when you're finished, when they're finished delivering the product. But again, I'm not talking about food packaging there. I think for food packaging, I mean, this is a full shift to reusables wherever possible. And that's not something that's going to be easy to get to, but it's a really important shift that we need to make. And I think that's really where government resources should be focused. I think industry has to think much more seriously about it, because it is the only way we're going to get to zero plastic waste.
Tunde, thoughts on that? You mentioned reuse as well, but you also talked about other pathways or alternatives. Wonder if you've looked at the trade-offs.
Right. I would strongly agree with Karen, and I think reusable is definitely the way to go. In terms of alternatives, we shouldn't be focusing on single use. The caveat with reusables is that it's also dependent on consumer behavior, right? Because if consumers treat reusables just like they've done single use, then we're even in a worse scenario, particularly from a carbon footprint standpoint. So we need consumer buying. That's going to be key to really maximize, extract the full value of reusables. What we see in the landscape is that bio-based materials are also quite popular. I mean, obviously it's contentious. There are those that are for and against it. A word of caution would be that for bio-based materials, we have to be really careful as to the sourcing, particularly on a life cycle perspective, because depending on the kind of biomass materials that you use, the greenhouse gas emissions may not be better than what you currently have. In the case of in comparison to polystyrene, for instance. And again, depending on what happens at the end of life, the bio-based materials can also lead to methane emissions in landfills. So we need to be careful in the way that we actually manage the materials when we're talking about alternatives. If I take a look at as an example, I know this is a non-packaging application. Take a look at the building sector in Canada, which is 12% of our entire emissions. The likelihood is that you're going to need polystyrene is one of the insulating materials that are used, and we're going to need insulating materials to bring down emissions to make homes energy efficient. So alternatives to polystyrene in that regard, again, it's really slim in terms of how they compare on a greenhouse gas emissions perspective. So we're going to take a look at not only material to material comparison, but also as they apply in a particular sector, for example, buildings, as I just mentioned.
Thanks, Tunde. Cassie, any thoughts from your side on the trade-offs or the unintended consequences of bans, for example?
Absolutely. So yeah, would love to directly answer the bans question. And bans sound really good. They're really simple, quick to implement. We can feel like we did something, but at the end of the day, bans are not the answer. They seem like an easy solution, but they don't work in practice for 3 reasons. The first, bans are typically aimed at packaging. And while the scope of the ban may be restricted to packaging, polystyrene is not. Packaging doesn't exist in a vacuum, and therefore the consequences of it don't either. If you read the text of these bans, they always have a section of exceptions, even within packaging, such as meat trays. And this is because polystyrene is the best material for these applications. It's been used for decades for a reason, because it protects and insulates better than any alternative material, and because it uses less material than alternatives. In the past, this was beneficial from a cost perspective, but an additional benefit of this is less material is sustainability. So the second reason, since bans don't exist in a vacuum, the applications that are not in scope, such as healthcare and household appliance items, will become stranded without an end-of-life solution. A ban eliminates a segment of material that supports the business case for recycling and investment. So if we ban polystyrene packaging, other polystyrene applications will be left without a recycling solution and will end up in a landfill. So this is why bans are a short-term solution, seemingly simple, but won't work in practice. And the third reason is INEOS Styrolution has seen firsthand that even the threat of bans incentivizes plastics converters, our customers, to switch to alternative materials which have a more negative impact on the environment. I've heard directly from a major brand owner that they know that a switch to an alternative material is actually worse for the environment in terms of carbon impact and weight of material used, but the alternative material is perceived as being more sustainable, so they plan to make the switch anyway. Bans have caught on because they seem like and are sold as a quick, simple solution. However, like so many other things, quick, simple solutions have unintended consequences and are not effective at solving the underlying problem. Innovation, on the other hand, is much more difficult and time-consuming, but in the long term will allow us to come out ahead and achieve what is our shared goal of a more sustainable economy.
So, I mean, you touched on the potential and intended consequences of alternatives. There are a lot of questions in the chat box about, alternative opportunities. One, I think, Tunde, you touched on a little bit already, the biostyrofoam question. I actually picked up a package, or actually had a delivery that was food recipes in a box, and it came with an LDPE film wrapped biofoam, which you could put into a bucket and put water on it and dissolved into water in seconds. I was impressed by that, but I wonder about the trade-offs. Where's the feedstock coming for this material? Does it have a carbon footprint, when you dissolve it, for example, as well? So there is those questions. There's another question in the chat box too about, are there any applications where rigid polystyrene cannot be replaced by, say, HDPE or polypropylene? Does anybody have any thoughts on that question in terms of where rigid polystyrene today is playing a unique sort of role?
I can touch on it if you'd like, Paul. So I am not necessarily a polymer scientist. I'm a chemical engineer, but each of these plastics originated and was developed and engineered to serve a specific purpose. And the reason that all different types of plastic exist is because they actually provide unique properties and solutions. So, a polyethylene cup may look very similar to a polystyrene cup, but when you get into more advanced applications like yogurt pots, for instance, where you need not only that strength, but the barrier properties to prevent oxygen from getting in and spoiling the food, there are applications where you cannot substitute polystyrene with a different polymer. And again, if you do so, perhaps you use more of that polymer at the end of the day in order to get those same properties.
But I think that this is where we need to look at non-single-use plastic alternatives, right? And probably non-plastic alternatives that are reusable. Because this is, again, we're just getting into discussions about regrettable substitutions of one plastic polymer for another that's going to be also difficult to collect and recycle at the end of life, and will not, frankly, displace anything that's coming from the ground when we do recycle it. So I think we really shouldn't be looking to another single-use polymer to replace any polymers that we're getting out of.
Any other thoughts? There's a question, I think a couple of comments actually in the question and chat box as well around sort of inspiring innovation in this space. Some saying that bans or regulation could actually drive innovation. Others asking sort of what CPP is doing in the innovation space. And just to say, we have 8 different working groups underway, many of which are bringing partners together across the value chain to look for solutions. We have a working group or rapid action group launching soon on reuse. We have ones on different types of materials and packaging types, on redesign, et cetera. A lot of the partners are coming together with innovation and pilots to sample and to bring forward solutions in this space. I wonder if anybody wants to touch on sort of the innovation that's needed to really drive change in this area.
Yeah, Paul, I would just add that there needs to be much more of a value chain collaboration that we see, particularly in the upstream side of things. So what do I mean by that is, for example, some of the early stage, smaller companies developing technologies that can recycle, say, polystyrene back to the monomer. In conversations with some of these entities, they often face challenges with having partnerships with, established players in the upstream petrochemical side of things, essentially because the technology is quite disruptive to the business of many of these players. Because if you can go back to the monomer, and all of a sudden your customer changes, right? If you're a mechanical recycler, your customer was originally somebody who, you're dependent on, brokers finding you markets, et cetera, in the marketplace. If you can go back to the monomer, then you can just sell directly to those folks who are producing polystyrene, which it obviously disrupts and creates competition with established petrochemical entities that produce the monomer as well. So there needs to be, I would say, increased collaboration between these two entities. It shouldn't be an either-or approach. We should be seeking to try and deploy these technologies quick and fast to mitigate pollution and get polystyrene material part and parcel of the circular economy. So that value chain collaboration would be one thing I would emphasize.
Question.
It's Kimi. Maybe I'm just going to build on Tunde's comments because I think he's bang on, and I think a lot of the panelists today are part of the Canada Plastics Pact, and we're trying to figure out different ways to look at the whole thing. And Karen has some really good points about, how do we avoid a lot of the single-use packaging and not just replace it? How do we not just deal with it at the end of life? There's a lot of fun innovation things actually that you can do as you look at how a customer or how any of us deal with the products that we buy and what we do with the packaging. So, you put a lot of great minds together. You can think of different ways to eliminate packaging that you don't really need. Reuse and refill is a challenge that I think we'll all have to try and figure out how you don't create some unintended consequences, because transportation, especially with a very distributed population that we have in Canada, is a challenge. And I know our retail stores are not built also to collect all that stuff back. So we're going to have to think differently, and us as consumers are going to have to act differently. So we've all got a role to play in how this works. But it's not a single stream. It's not a golden, solution that'll solve it all. There's every aspect of the supply chain has got to look at it. And we as Canadians got to look at how we do things differently as well.
Thanks for sharing that, Kimi. Go ahead.
A little bit about some pilot that we did on the collection side. So mentioned that we collect this material at depots. We did pilot earlier this year for about 6 months, collecting it at the curb in its own stream, that along with flexible plastics. So we had a bag or a box, and we gave residents a chance to put this material out. This was in a 3-stream neighborhood, which typically collects mixed paper, mixed containers, and mixed glass. In 3 different streams. So we had that regular truck going around to their houses. Then we had another truck coming around, which was able to collect 2 streams, the foam and the flexible packaging. So it was really an early stage pilot to understand what this looks like and what kind of participation it would be. There's obviously great challenges collecting 5 different streams of material from a given house. How do you divide a truck 5 ways to keep all this stuff separate? But we will be looking at that and understanding, what are the knock-on effects, where might this lead in the future, things like that. But no immediate breakthroughs in this space, I will say.
Rob, I see you're actively answering questions as they come in, so thanks for doing that, as some of the others are too. Wonder if you want to just speak to the question that you just had there, and the response that you were putting together. And I might just tack on, my own question for you around the innovation space. As a small business or small, medium-sized company operating in Canada, what sort of things do you need to support the scale up of your sort of work in this area?
Primarily, one of the biggest challenges is that, as I answered the question, that is most landfills, virtually all landfills, enable styrofoam waste because they charge based on weight, and styrofoam is just a special category where it's high volume and no weight. And they don't charge based on the actual environmental impact. So you can take a trailer full of styrofoam and of loose foam and drop it at the landfill for $65 if it's your own equipment. The tip fee is just that. And yet, any other material that you would be dropping it off, you would be paying, exponentially more, vast more multiples. So that's where municipalities need to recognize that there are special categories of material that you have to have a differential tip fee to accurately measure and obviously, dissuade the cheap, easy, and obviously much more destructive solution of just throwing in the ground because it's out of sight and out of mind. So that's primarily one of the biggest things, that if it is a level playing field, there's viable alternatives out there. And, we do over 70 municipalities in Alberta without a differential landfill fee. But when they looked at the math, the metrics, when we explained it to them, they went, yeah, you know what? There's a business case to be made to save money by recycling it instead of letting it go in the ground.
Do you want to touch anything in terms of the innovation space for your own company beyond sort of the regulatory environment?
Sure. Certainly in the medium term, plastics are here to stay. So I don't see bans being very effective, especially where so much comes from overseas. And certainly plastics, I think COVID taught us that plastics will never go away forever, because in times of need, plastics are the ultimate solution for certain medical and other issues. It's just really, we need to up our game for recycling and innovation to figure out how do we have a plan and, a buffet of options that regardless of the materials we're handling, we have options to make sure it gets recycled back into the economy. And certainly one thing we're very much pursuing, as I mentioned, is it's kind of that I drove, 150 miles to save 10 cents on butter. So why take the material, turn it into blocks, and then ship it halfway around the planet for them to recycle it into something and ship it all the way back? I'm sure if somebody did the math, that it would come out probably at best a wash for greenhouse gas and carbon, even though it's, diverting it from landfill. So that's important. But we've been really pursuing domestic recycling options. In the chat box, somebody mentioned polystyrene. There's also Pyrowave. There are some really game-changing innovations coming to market that will take plastic waste and convert it into fantastic products here in Canada. And that's absolutely the best option, where you could take something and then turn it into another viable product that displaces original oil and gas and let it go into things that actually need to be done with oil and gas, like fertilizer and hospital grade stuff and whatever. And so that innovation is happening right now as we speak, and certainly we're playing a part of it by we are the missing link, that we are, as you mentioned, a very widely dispersed population, and collecting from that wide geographic area. That's the challenge. How do you collect all this stuff and get it to the unique specialized manufacturing facilities in an economical fashion? And that's the role that Styrogo plays, and where we fit into, we're just one little link in the very long food chain that's going to make this work.
So I think we're at a really interesting tipping point, obviously in time and in space, with respect to where we're at with this resin. Historically, the system hasn't been working, but we've heard a lot of interesting considerations today from all the different panel speakers and perspectives around technologies and alternatives, and just thinking differently about how we approach packaging in general, whether it's reuse or elimination or other factors. So I want to just take another pulse of the audience here by asking them the question again that we put forward at the very beginning of this poll, to get a sense of the role of polystyrene or EPS in a sustainable Canadian circular economy, plastics packaging economy, and do people feel there is a role here? So we're going to ask the same question we asked at the beginning. We'll compare the results just to see if we've had any differences. We had about 40%, 41% or so last time that were undecided. And we've seen kind of an opportunity to maybe help people shape their thinking throughout this conversation. So we're about 2/3 have weighed in so far on this question. Give people another couple minutes here, and then we'll reveal the results. Not quite 100%. We had about 3/4, but there's trickled down now for the results. So why don't we go ahead and share those, Isabel? About 40% think there is a role for polystyrene EPS in a circular plastic packaging economy. A lower number undecided, and still a strong percentage anyway that feel that it doesn't have a place. So, interesting to compare to our first poll, which if you go to the next slide, I think you've added the results from the first poll. So the undecided has significantly come down, and interesting to think about that as we sort of do a bit of a wrap up. So what I might do is just invite people, go to the next slide, or we can just stop sharing the slides again, to provide their final thoughts, some closing thoughts, maybe a minute or so, and then we'll wrap up. Just for the audience, why don't we go in the same order as we began? Cassie, if you don't mind going first, over to you.
Sure. So I want to thank everybody for their time today. Certainly, we acknowledge that things are not perfect, right? There's big problems that need to be solved, big challenges that lie ahead. But we are working hard as a polystyrene industry to make these innovations a reality. And we're eager to work with everyone across the value chain. We know no one member of the value chain is going to be able to do this alone. And we want to support the recycling companies and all the collection and sorting companies as well, and ultimately get to, again, what is our shared goal, I think, of finding a solution that's environmentally friendly and the most sustainable in the long term. So thank you very much.
Karen, over to you.
Yep, thanks for having me join today. I don't think there is room for polystyrene in a circular packaging world. In terms of polling, the most recent polling of Canadians I've seen was from a poll conducted last year by Oceana, in which 2/3 of Canadians would like to see styrofoam banned altogether. So, I mean, I think we all recognize, like, it's in the popular consciousness, it is a problematic material, and we should really stop using it for packaging.
Short and concise. Thank you.
And I am next, I think.
Over to you, Kimmy. That's right.
So I guess I have a question or an ask for everybody who's on the call. So thanks for showing up. I think this is an important topic and we all need to be engaged to make a difference. So as a consumer, check and know what your local recycling programs are. Recycle where you can. So there are a lot of jurisdictions, and kudos to the folks in BC. I spent some time with Sam, and the BC residents do a far better job at sorting and recycling than the rest of the country. So we've got a higher bar to do. If you're a producer or a retailer, know what your packaging is, try and make it better, get rid of what you can, and then try different alternatives that might be more circular, whether it's refill or reuse.
Thanks for the guidance. I like that. Rob?
Yeah, just as I said, styrofoam waste isn't going away, being where the vast majority of it comes from overseas, where we have, little control. And as I said, I really see it as an above ground resource that, I mean, if people are sending it to us and it plays a part of our modern economy, the obvious solution is to, instead of trying to change the system that delivers high quality goods at a low cost across the country, a better alternative would be to develop a system where, instead of seeing it as a waste, seeing it as basically a wonderful resource that they're shipping to us for free, and certainly something we can use to displace virgin oil and gas production, because some materials aren't going to go away. There'll be a need for some things that can't be replaced with fibers and wood, and by recycling resin to make those, we're displacing the original virgin resin to get used in more important areas where it can't be replaced from there.
Thanks, Rob. Sam?
Yeah, thanks again for having me. So I think all those great properties of EPS that make it so good as a packaging type really play to the challenges of collecting it and processing it. So, you get great benefits here, but detriment over here. And so, as targets go up across the country, our infrastructure is like what we have in BC going to be able to keep up with those targets to get those capture rates that are mandated? And will stewards be willing to bear the cost of EPS as EPR programs roll out across the country and this becomes much more at the forefront of their operational costs? So
Good questions to ponder. Good questions to ponder. Thank you, Sam. And Tunde, closing thoughts to you.
Yeah, thanks for everyone for the great conversation. This is a burning issue, this issue of plastics pollution and the lack of recycling, be it polystyrene, all the kinds of plastic. And it's not our problem alone. In my view, it's also an opportunity to develop an innovation agenda as to how we rethink plastics within the broader chemicals sector in Canada, and the need to highlight the need to develop an innovation strategy to bring forward solutions. So that would be those would be my final thoughts on the issue.
Perfect. Let's bring up the last slide. Thank you to everybody. Thanks to the panel for your perspectives. Lots of good data and information that was shared as part of the conversation today. We have a recording that we'll send out to everybody that registered, as well as the slide deck that people can get access to. That includes a few links and that to other information. Thanks very much to the participants that were able to join today. We had a very active Q&A box and lots of questions were answered by the panel as we went along too. So thanks for your contributions. And just to say, we invite you to be part of our future Brave Conversation series events. We are still on the look for our next Brave Conversation topic. And so we'll be coming back to people with ideas and suggestions there for the next Brave Conversation. We invite you to sign up for updates from the Plastics Pact. I'm just dropping in the chat box here a link to our website and our monthly newsletter. But also if you sign up for the mailing list, you will get updates on events and publications and other things that you might find of interest. So once again, thanks to everybody.